the topics to consider in the Snug Cove design guidelines. And then we'll add an election there too, for item 3.1.
Has everyone had a chance to read the minutes?
Yes.
Any issues?
My comment was, I think Emma was there as staff in attendance. So she's there as saying that she provided documents and stuff.
Okay,
It's like,
thank you.
okay.
As amended.
Yes, recommendation. All in favor? As amended. Public comments. We don't have any, obviously. New business.
So we'll do an election now as part of the meeting. Acting chair.
Does somebody want to put forward an acting chair?
I forward that Jeremy be acting chair for this meeting.
I second.
All in favor?
All in favor.
Go for it.
All right, Snug Cove Design Guidelines update. Jennifer.
I have slides, so I think I'm going to roll around so that I'm not sitting in front of my own presentation.
Mike says the ferry,
Wow.
and he sends his apologies.
Okay, so I'm here to be the primary staff person for all of you in the process of looking at the Snug Cove Design Guidelines as an update. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover the project directives in the context of why we're looking at this, how it relates to the objectives in the OCP, touching shortly on arts and crafts, since that's kind of core to this project, and then quickly review some of the existing guidelines, a bit on current best practices for guideline documents, and then finally we'll consider a recommendation about how we'd like to proceed. So starting with the project directive, the main one is in the island plan, this priority B3, which you're probably familiar with, that basically says that we are to review the design guidelines and affirm the arts and crafts nature. So that is kind of the most specific directive that we're following here. And there was a report in May that I believe Daniel put together that was kind of updating council on that particular directive, stating that so far in 2019 we haven't got started on it yet, so this will be the initial starting, but there's no separate funding source. And some of the next steps that they looked at was doing some public consultation, having staff digitize the guidelines, and the direction was basically, sure, let's look at what the possible scope might be. So that's where we are now. It's coming from this directive. So there was no particular decision at that time. It was just, let's look at it and put a staff person on it. So here I am. Okay, so here's what's happened so far. The design guidelines that you have in your packet are unchanged from the design guidelines as they originally came out, with the exception of it's now all typed into Word. So it was originally a scanned image. You couldn't work with it at all. So all of the images are the same, the words are the same. It's just that now if we want to make comments in Word or print it and make it look nicer so it's more legible, we can do that. So that's all that's happened. That says digitizing, that's what I mean when I say that. And then I took some time to review some of the current bylaws and plans to see what in there is relevant to this, and that's been put together into this presentation. I also went around and found out what photos we have to use to make the guidelines more up to date in office, and there wasn't that much, so I went out and took some more so that we have something to work with. And then I also looked at what are some guidelines that are following best practices, what are the best practices, what are some award-winning design guidelines, so that we'd get an idea of, what would be a super good design guideline. Okay, there's been a whole bunch of past initiatives of looking at the Snug Cove, either as a design area or specific items within that, whether that's fairy marshalling or whatever. So there's a long history of looking at various items. The ones on the right are the more recent studies, but it's not clear what exactly the relationship is between those several projects and what's actually happening on the ground now. Currently, we have some initiatives that may relate to any update to the design guidelines, including the cultural plan, transportation plan, the parks plan, the fairy marshalling bylaw that came out recently, the new active design guidelines that just came out in the last couple of weeks. And then we have this workshop report on the community lands as well that could be informative. Upcoming, we have a few things as well. The Heritage Strategic Plan, which I think is an item on the list as well, that's coming up kind of in this next 12 months or so, should be coming out. We're starting on public engagement for that soon. And I'm also the staff person on that, so it should be easy to keep aware of what's going on. The Economic Development Plan, which Helen is working on internally, and so that's also happening in the next couple of years and will also involve public engagement. And then finally, the housing strategy would obviously need to be integrated in. So there's a lot of things happening at the same time. Okay, so let's look at the OCP. The big picture that I have noticed from looking at the OCP is that there's kind of two competing messages about what should happen in Snug Cove. One is that there's increasing pressure for both residential and commercial development in the area, and the other is maintaining the established scale, form, and character of development. So those two things are kind of in play together, and in the OCP there's objectives for each one. But there isn't much that kind of brings it together and clarifies how do we deal with these two tensions. Okay, quick thing on the arts and crafts style. It is originally from Britain. It was particularly popular from 1880 to 1920. And there's kind of two parts to it. One is a look that people think of when they think of the arts and crafts, which is kind of personified by the photograph. But the other is the philosophy behind how that look was derived, which is based on certain philosophies about simplicity and there's a socialist background to it. So there's different ways that it can be interpreted as either something from history or something that is an idea that's applied and can change over time. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about what arts and crafts might mean. I've included just a few photographs of Snug Cove today. Probably go through it all the time, so you don't need to be reminded, but basically there's a mix of some more heritage types of buildings and landscaping to buildings that have just come out recently, and then also it's hugely important to infrastructure, both vehicular and utilities and all kinds of other things, ferries. So there's a lot of things coming together. Okay, the existing design guidelines get a little bit complicated because we find the direction for them in several different documents that are often overlapping. So I will try to just do this really quickly. The basics for where they're applied is in the OCP. There we find a map that indicates the village boundary and then the two DP areas, the B6 and B5. So I'll start with the outer and then we'll work our way in. So in the village periphery, we just have policy 94 that gives us an idea of the atmosphere that's desired within that red line. And it indicates a few different things. I don't want to get too much in detail with this. I'm just putting the information here for later reference. And then as we move into the village periphery, in this area, it's more about having the form and character of this commercial, industrial, multifamily, residential idea. You can see it in the purpose there, and the form and character, and then respecting the adjacent usages. So this one seems to be more about a nice transition. And then we also find, so not only in the OCP is there direction, but also in the land use bylaw, in section 7.3, that's where the DP area guidelines are written. So there's a series of bullet points which I've shortened here, but you can see just the general scope of what it covers. So it talks about landscape, views, how it relates to existing buildings, the type of building forms that are desirable, all kinds of things are covered in this. And that's in the land use bylaw. Okay, so that was the village periphery DP. And now if we move further in to the village revitalization area, which was the pink in the closest downtown, here's where we hear again about the arts and crafts theme. It talks about it being a hub and key to the establishment of the village center, and then also about form and character, looking at siding and form, exterior design, all this stuff. So this is all in the OCP, and then there's also a corresponding section in the land use bylaw, section 7.3, that again has guidelines in the bullet point form, and here shortened again. So now in the land use bylaw, it has parking requirements, FSR, site coverage requirements, height restrictions, all kinds of things that you would normally see in zoning is also here. So there's some issue here with potential conflict between the zoning and this section of the land use bylaw. And then importantly, at the end, it says the design guidelines document Schedule E, which is what you have printed out there with the old black and white photographs, applies to this pink zone. So that is the guidelines document that we're looking at updating. So it already has kind of a complicated relationship with the existing legislative groupings. Yes?
All those are fine, but you've left out the big one. How do you enforce it? And I used the last building that was just built, the distillery, and I can't see anything that is anywhere near the guidelines.
Right, and that's
Or
one
the
of
parking, or the sizes. They don't even have the apartments open that were supposed to be built for them, or my property in the backside cleared up and finished. But they're open. You mean, let them open.
Yeah, exactly. So the point about enforcement is one of the reasons why we're looking at this as well, because if whatever form these things are in, if it's not being enforced or if you're not finding it useful, then perhaps that would be a reason to revisit the document.
Well, you might as well throw the whole thing around. I mean, I don't see anything in this document that you've approved. You know, there isn't anything on that building. And I just use it as an example because it's the latest one.
Yeah. I mean, I think that has been, the same point that you're making has come up many times, so you're not the only one that's thinking that as well. So that's definitely something that we'll be thinking about. And see, I mean, I think it's worth questioning whether the design guidelines is the right format, if that's what we want, or, you know, these are all questions that we can discuss. So shall I go into the document now?
That just saying it.
And we'll take a look at the design guidelines document itself. We'll definitely have time to discuss. So this document was originally prepared by the ADP group back in 2002. And some of the quotes from this document seem to still possibly be applicable today. So functional village center of undeniable charm, effective mixture of these different uses, a gateway to Bowen Island. So these are similar words that we're seeing in more recent documents as well. And the contents of this document range from design requirements to technical requirements. It's in two sections. And the design requirements cover all types of different issues, from transportation, vehicular and pedestrian, the idea of the village center, views, the aesthetics of the individual buildings and massing, signage, landscaping, and even the color of the buildings. And then the technical requirements get into some other issues like performance bonds, servicing the sites, landscaping, and parking requirements in a bit more technical way. So that's kind of the way that it's organized now, and that's something that we could think about whether it's useful moving forward or not. I think I've seen most of you kind of flipping through, so you'll get an idea of what the imagery looks like and how the ideas are portrayed in there. So here's just a few images. This is the view corridors that we're wanting to be maintained at that time, and then some ideas for design, door designs, and signage examples, which I include that image because I think it shows kind of the range of image quality, whereas on the left it's a bit easier to read than the one on the right. So in quick summary of the existing document, not in terms of how it's applied, but how it's written, it has both strengths and weaknesses. The strengths being a strong vision about this arts and crafts concept, matching the values that we have in the OCP now, and some nice inspirational ideas. But on the other hand, it lacks some clarity, it's not up to date, and it has both overreach and underreach of scope, which I'll get into a bit more in detail when I talk about the best practices, but basically that sometimes it's doing things that other documents, other types of regulations should do, and sometimes it's not doing what a design guideline should do. Okay, so that's the end of that part, and I'll move down to best practices if there's no questions or comments on that. Okay, so to look at best practices, these are just the covers of the documents that I reviewed, and they were identified based on both comparable cities to Bowen, or municipalities to Bowen, but also some places that were quite different but had been recognized for having such great design guidelines. So I kind of went with both things and gathered stuff all up. And then also there's a course at SFU that indicates the best practices for design guidelines. So a lot of this is based on that as well. So in general, the best practices for design guidelines are that they would serve as an excellent resource for designers rather than something that they would dread as a control mechanism. That they would include the rationale behind what the statements are so that people can be sure to conform to the intent of the design guideline, that they would be straightforward, simple, with graphical communications, and that they would not have zoning or development standards embedded within them. Those two functions would be separate. In order to be clear, these are the three kind of main bullet points that were expressed in the SFU course. That was distinguishing between what is essential and what's negotiable on a project. What are the means versus what are the ends of creating what you're trying to get to, and then that they would have meaning both to the public and also to decision makers. So it should be a document that can speak to many different audiences. So now I'll have some examples from some of the documents that I found that I thought might be useful. So one of the tips is to illustrate concepts as much as possible so it's easy to understand. Here's an example, I think it's from Boston, of signage that is desirable versus not desirable. And it's accompanied by a text that describes it, but you can also see that the definitions of the signs are actually in the image. So you can see immediately what a box sign is versus a billboard versus a big store sign, because they've just named them on the image. They would also be well structured with a similar page structure for each element so that it's easy to find what you're looking for and to differentiate between what is the background of something, what's the intent, and then what actually needs to be followed within the guidelines, and then images that illustrate those ideas. They're also often multi-scalar, ranging from the neighborhood scale, which in our case would be the entire area, down to corridors, generally transportation or pedestrian corridors, even intersection scale concepts, and then as we continue down, the relationship between buildings themselves and the elements within that, the street furniture and street elements, and then even down to details. So they would range through that whole thing. And that's a discussion that we can have regarding how interested you are in these different scales and how useful you think they might be.
Well, you might bring zoning into it, because if the building that we're talking about, the distillery, has into the zoning, it doesn't make any sense. What you're asking for in the zoning, you're wasting our time.
Mm-hmm.
And then, not you, but we are wasting our time, because there's no design input at all.
So sometimes that might come in if you're looking at someone asking for a variance or a zoning change. then this can help to guide whether that would be something that's in community interest or not. But in general, the best practices recommend that the two things are kept separate. So things like, you know, the FSR or building height would be stipulated in the zoning. And then this one, we're going more for the design aspects. Yes.
I would agree that all this is pretty essential in terms of improving the clarity of it, but I noticed in going over some of the documents, particularly the one on Victoria's plan, they have all these very specific requirements for facades and building rhythms and so on, and then they show an example of the result of it, and it's ugly. It's not a building you care about. So to me, that design guideline fails.
Yeah, there's a
So there's something that needs to be captured there that's not quite right, in the same sense of some failings we've had, in part probably because of the design panel's decision, but there's not congruence between the end result, as Ronnie said, and the design guidelines.
Yeah, that's a great point. We're keeping our eye on what are we ultimately trying to achieve, and
The design guides, the way they're written now, leaves the flexibility for the architect to do a good building. It's just showing them what we'd sort of like to see in the code.
so this
But
is
the
definitely.
language isn't strong enough, that's the problem.
Say again?
The language of it is not strong enough to,
Well, it isn't, the language isn't strong enough. It's guidelines, but it's the enforcement that isn't strong enough. So they just go ahead and do what they want to anyway. They, meaning
yeah, I
example.
understand what you're saying, but you don't, if you don't have the language in the guide or in the land use planning, there's nothing to enforce.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say.
That's why
We should
it's
give more
easier.
power to the municipality so they can enforce it through planning.
And that can definitely be a part of this process. If after we've redone the guidelines, we then feel that there needs to be an adjustment to, or an amendment to the land use bylaw or a new bylaw proposal that would serve as some of that enforcement mechanism that can come out of it. But one of the things that comes from the best practices is that when a guideline is a good one, and it's a quality one, that it actually saves design panels like yourselves a lot of heartache, and architects, because ideally they would bring in a project that's already compliant with what you want because they read the guidelines and they understood them and they were feasible enough to them that they were able to apply it in advance rather than having so much fighting back and forth.
Yeah,
Yes.
there isn't any fighting. There was just never any suggestion that he was gonna do anything good.
Well, the way things have distilled in my time on this committee is that basically a design is presented and then it's sort of a haggling. Well, there have been cases where we just said, like the first iteration of that distillery building was no way, but the second iteration was hardly much of a modification. I mean, you start feeling sorry for the guy and all the energy that's been put into it, but if they're not paying attention right from the get-go to the guidelines, you're gonna get in that situation. And we've been in that, you know, the same thing with the credit union building. It was, you know, it's a post-fact, after the fact, deliberation that goes on, where, rather than, as you were saying, it should come and should be strong and forceful enough right at the start that it's clear to a developer and a designer that these things are sine qua non. So you have to fall within them, be creative within these boundaries. But that's not been what's happening, for sure.
And perhaps one of the things that we should consider in this process is leaving some extra energy or whatever at some point to make sure that people are aware of the guidelines, so that at a minimum.
Yeah, that it
it's
should be
greater-
front and center on any proposal. When there's an approval to proceed with the project right at the absolute ground level, that be strongly presented and enforced. This must be the case, not maybe. And I mean, there's always room for negotiation in these things, but that seems to be the assumption, you know, sort of see what we can get away with, and then negotiate ourselves out of the guidelines. And, well, maybe some of them are expensive, but what do you want? I mean, it's about the quality of the lived environment, so.
There might be a procedural review aspect of this too, if you're interested in that.
Mhm.
If you
Yeah,
feel
well-
that that's where some of this is falling apart.
Yeah, I don't, it's very onerous in this committee to be in a position of always having to say no, because they haven't presented something that's congruent. I mean, you could just simply have some initial thing, is there any congruence? You just, no more discussion. Well, they shouldn't even have spent any time on a design that's not congruent, because of course that's an added expense for them, but they have to be aware that it's going to be, it's not going to be conforming, and it won't be accepted. Otherwise, it's kind of meaningless.
Yeah. I mean, it's my hope that we would have better compliance at the beginning.
Yeah,
at the
there's
end
got to
of
be
this
some way
if we
to
do
make
it.
that emphatic,
Mhm.
and I think that's one of the, I guess that's the enforcement issue that Ronnie's talking about, is really at the beginning, to say, this is the way it is. You can play within this set of patterns, but, yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of our current guidelines, like if you were developing a vacant lot, like the gravel parking lot next to the tennis store, and we said, okay, you have to follow the design guidelines. In terms of, what to, like when you're designing, there's lots in here about sort of the public realm and the pedestrians and the vehicles. And in terms of like building a building, it's like there's one page, that's page 20 here, that says typical features of arts and crafts style architecture are such things as, like it's little points. And yeah.
It's terrible.
So we think, we hand that to the architect and say, okay, meet this. There's not, they'll say, okay, I've ticked, I have natural features and I have a gable roof and I have a something. And we say, well, it's not meeting that. And so from my point of view, it's how do we better articulate that? So that,
Exactly. The language of that guideline needs to be, or additional illustrations or whatever, but it
I mean, there are even within the arts and crafts overview, there are a whole series of principles, like contrasts, windows that are either square or vertical, not horizontal. You just don't see those in traditional buildings. A whole bunch of things that are kind of fundamental. Contrast is a huge one, and modern buildings typically suffer from lack or so much minimal contrast in it, and our eyes are geared to contrast. The basic perceptual things about design that are fundamental. It should be not only getting us, all the time.
Yeah.
Well, I use as an example, not the theoretical things that you're talking about, you're right, but simple things as windows and doors. Like, there is no window up there that isn't one pane, for the whole thing that's 4 foot or 8 foot wide by 6 foot high or whatever it is, as opposed to an arts and crafts that has multiple panes. Just simple details like that is what it means.
Well, there's kind of even a normative thing, but they've done studies about that. People will reflexively prefer true divided light windows over single expanses of glass. For whatever reason, that's the way people respond. There is kind of a normative thing underlying all of this.
They cost more, though.
They do.
And they cost more to maintain.
Yeah.
And that's why they want to put them in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And
So-
I use that as an example.
Ultimately, where I'm trying to get to at the end of this is an idea of to what extent do we want to do this review? Because the scope of this review could be very small or quite grandiose. So that's what I'm trying to cover here so that we can sort of make that decision.
Your comment, it can be very small for changing. It's the implementation that is missing. The zoning tie-in, the municipality's development department.
Yeah. So maybe
That's what
part
is-
of that scope becomes a recommendation about the procedure.
Not recommendations, but require some way. I don't know.
Oh, I mean you all recommending it,
Mhm.
not a recommendation to the public.
I think one of the first fundamental questions is, anybody have any issues with the arts and crafts ethos, that idea is relevant to Bowen?
I think it's a little limiting. I think it's a good taking off place, but, we're not living in 1910 anymore, and you can end up with too cutesy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you
ins-
cer- Yeah.
Instead
I
of
agree with
something
you.
that's vibrant. And when you look at the Cove, I was looking at, I made a comment actually in here, because it's all this stuff about natural colors, and, you opened with an opening picture of the Cove, and it's a bright turquoise building beside a bright yellow one, and that's delightful too, but it doesn't exactly fit mossy green and beige, So, yeah, I do have some issues with it.
There's certainly, my feeling about that, I agree, you don't want anything looking twee or cutesy, but, you look at Village Square, there's a couple of buildings there that are more in the vein. They have some of the basic principles. They have smaller windows, divided, interesting aspects and roof lines, and yet they're not, you would not call them classic arts and crafts, but the principles, and I think that's the gist of it to me, is there, within arts and crafts, a recognition of certain fundamental principles, like one being contrast, one
Yeah, that's
scale
same
of
with
the
Arts and
windows,
Square.
doors.
Articulation, right? It's all those elements, I think, primarily everyone is interested in, not necessarily arts and crafts as
Yeah.
a
Although the arts and crafts embodies that, there's, I think that's the thing, people get stuck up on, it's the principles behind arts and crafts, I think, that are the things that are reflected again and again in multiple reflections. You see this in if you read The Whistler, different building heights and frontages, and that buildings being designed to look small scale. He did this on the pub. It almost looks like 3 different buildings. I just wish they picked more vibrant colors. There's a point what Betty said, Betty, about colors. In this dark winter environment, the restriction of earth and tones is pretty miserable. You look at the buildings in Greenland, they're all multicolored,
Yeah.
or in Latham Island in Yellowknife.
Yeah.
Yellowknife is just a dump, but Latham Island is the old buildings, they're all brightly colored and painted, and it's appealing. Everybody likes, gravitates to those kinds of things. Anyway, so is there any kind of clarification on the arts and crafts, or are we just in general principle agreed that that's a reasonable idea, or if not, how do you want to rephrase it?
It's as good as any that I can think of as a guideline. Again, I go back to the distillery. What color is it other than black? That's what we want to avoid, but somehow it was black.
Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of wondering, with this conversation, is it something about a conflict between a design aspiration and cost effectiveness? Is the cost of buildings what's
That's always in
going
there.
on here? Are we asking for something that they don't really want to give us, or?
Well, that's probably why a lot of the buildings look the way they do, the newer ones, is because, like Ronnie said, it's expensive to do those things. But of course, it's the difference between, would you care if the distillery was bulldozed tomorrow? I don't think most people would. But if it's a building that is beautiful and embodies those sort of the deep background characteristics, say, of the arts and crafts, not an exact replica of arts and crafts, then it has stamina through time. And you see that in, traditional traditional cities everywhere.
Mhm.
People spend, that's where they go, to the old parts, not because they're old, but because they're beautiful, and they're design, they were based on people, not cars or anything else, and nobody goes to the shopping mall areas, you know, they're just dead zones.
Yeah. The best example of good guidelines I can think of is Artisan Square. You know, it's, works.
It works as a
fits
social
most of those
space.
guidelines. It isn't, you know, they didn't try to push out of them.
They were sort of developed by
One
like
developer.
one developer.
Then what?
They were developed by one developer,
Yes.
right? So in terms of that, it's like,
It's an
somebody,
economy of
it's
scale.
easier to make have somebody who does, all the buildings look the same versus when they're all owned individually and each person.
Well, no, it was a developer that Wolfgang Duntz with, who was his partner at the time, did most of the drawings.
But it does look like a planned community, and I actually don't agree with that. I don't like Artisan Square. It's just, to me, it's boring. And I think that part of the vibrancy of Snug Cove is that you have the library and you have those little cottages that the restaurants and things are in, and you have your place, and they're all quite different. Like, I wouldn't call your buildings classic arts and craft either. There's something summer cottage, East Coast, something. They're not quite.
And yet, if you look at the underlying principles in arts and crafts, and I don't mean the specific vernacular, but the underlying principles that they were trying to bring out, they're all there. They're at Dodge,
Yeah.
in the pub, they're in the little cabins and all the rest. And
So that takes a little more depth of sophistication, that sort of knowledge of what the underlying philosophy is versus.
Well, any
this.
architect should understand.
Yes,
that.
they absolutely should.
And yeah, as I was saying, if
So you need
sorry.
to get this, what you're talking about, these underlying things, these components that you want to assemble on paper. Not
Yeah,
a couple suggestions, like really, like some doors and, I don't know, like teapots and, I don't know, like it's not relatable.
so it's a theory and philosophy underneath it I think we need to articulate.
Well, and there's dangers there too, because if you, as I was saying it, in Victoria's thing, they articulate a whole bunch of things about facades and nature of windows and having lintels and heights of buildings and so on. And yet, when those were applied, the examples they gave were just plain ugly buildings. Again, I just looked at them and I thought, really? That's what results from it? That fails in the same way that we failed with some of the buildings in the Cove. So it is difficult, I guess, at the point. We need to find.
We should let you continue though.
It's a good thing to get out there though, because that's
We've got
definitely
2 or
something.
3 more
that-
lots that
Yeah.
are gonna be developed here very soon.
Well, I don't think we'll resolve it today. So perhaps there will be some things in here that will help. So in terms of visioning aids, imaging of what the design guidelines should produce can be helpful because it's a way to show how a proposal would help contribute to that eventual desired vision. So here's an example of before and after, but then there's also drawings or photographs of desirable outcomes. There's often a use of iconography in order to make it easier to understand and more enjoyable to read and that kind of thing so that people will be more likely to use it. And then also community buy-in is another important thing about, so that it's representative of what people want, but they also have a sense of ownership of the outcome. So then I had a discussion question just to find out how the guidelines are working for you. We've already sort of started talking about it, but I would be interested in hearing whether you've used this document and whether other people have been using it before they've come in, or was it something that you used, and how did it work for you?
Well, we've used it in the sense of trying to vet people's submissions, but there just seems to be an acquiescence to for the sake of somebody who's already come in and spent a gazillion dollars on architectural plans, and then we say it's not congruent, and they come back and it's, you know, they've done a little bit of this and that, sort of ticky-tacky add-on things that really don't amount, that are vaguely in the spirit of it, but really don't get it. And of course, ultimately, you don't want to just discourage them and say, well, no, this is, you know, third time lucky, try that, you know. Yeah, it's
So do
hard.
they not get that imperative when they first come in and say, I'm applying
That's
for
it,
a
yeah, they
building
don't.
permit? I mean, I remember building and being told, you're in a development zone, you need this, this, and this, boom. Don't we do that to them?
No.
So,
No?
no, we do.
Yeah.
And I do know with that project in particular, that was the previous planner who maybe wasn't as supportive of the general development permit guidelines. I think was when that project started. That's my understanding. I didn't overlap with her at all. But in general, like if somebody says, oh, I'm looking at a lot in, you know, in Snug Cove and I want to build something, we'd say, okay, you're going to develop permit guideline. Or develop permit area, these are the guidelines, these are the guidelines.
Yeah, it's like historical.
You're going to need to develop permits.
Yeah.
So like, for example, the Area 1, that vacant lot that the municipality is selling next to the museum, it's in the periphery. So everyone, whenever we have it up for sale and people would ask, we'd say, okay, it's in the periphery, so you need a development permit and you have to follow the periphery guidelines, which are like 4 points that you know, match the neighboring, match the character or whatever. So it is a standard part of what we talk about. And I would say probably any architect in looking at it does look at these and goes, okay, but I don't quite know. Like from this, I would know that I need to look sort of arts and craftsy. And I wouldn't necessarily know what level of detail. And so then how and almost how seriously people take it, I think, is impacted by even just the effect of the design guidelines.
Yep.
So maybe it needs to be more concise and more philosophical, I don't know, more like theoretical, what we're trying to achieve as an outcome.
The examples that she had just shown from other design
Yeah.
guidelines were, would certainly be a step in the right direction to take this document and for us to distill and translate into something more legible, understandable, easier for those applying to understand what the actual intent is.
Well, if you look at if you read through the Whistler guidelines, apparently they're reasonably successful because there is a congruence within that. I mean, okay, it looks like a ski village, which is, seems contrived and everything, but at least it's congruent, and you don't have, you know, blaring anomalies jumping out at you. So somehow in that document is getting across. It may simply be that it is, as Ronnie says, an enforcement issue. They just say, you know, you're not, start out and look at what's around you and get the idea. I mean, you could send people to examples here, you know, send them to the library and I don't know, whatever other examples we have, or even Village Square is, you know, this is congruent design. But then there are other outstanding ones that somehow got through. You just have to tell them, ignore that. That's an anomaly. Because really, otherwise you've got to set a new standard. It's just not happening.
Okay, so shall we move to the next thing? All right. So the next bit is, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time thinking about what kind of topics the revamp of the design guidelines ought to cover, where we should spend our efforts, and kind of give us an idea of how big of a scope change might this be. So in order to think about that, generally when looking at design guidelines, and really a lot of different types of municipal documents, there's sort of two principles that help you decide whether a topic should be included or not. And the first is that it shouldn't be something that belongs somewhere else. So either not overlapping with something or not putting one type of regulation inside of another. So if we find something that really should be as a bylaw, then we would suggest it as a bylaw rather than trying to put it in the design guideline. Or if it's already covered in another plan, then we don't need to cover it here, like the ferry marshalling bylaw, we don't need to cover that in the design guidelines, for example. And then it would also be something that makes sense within that Snug Cove area. So it wouldn't be a guideline where it's something that you really would want to have all over the island, but because right now we're working on the design guidelines, we put it in there. It would be something specific to that Snug Cove area that makes it important to be in this particular document. So in just thinking about those criteria, I took some topics that are commonly covered or that are coming up because of changes in what's happening right now in terms of regulations, and started to look at, okay, do they overlap, and is it something unique to Snug Cove, and started just kind of brainstorming, put some stuff in there. And you also have a printout of this exact table. And my thought was that we could take some time, yes, that's the table, that we could take some time kind of looking at that and getting an idea of which items are the high priority items and which items do you think don't really belong or we don't need to worry about so much. So you can take some time looking at that, and with your pen, either like circle the priority things that are important or put some notes on the side as to more nuanced aspects of it, and then we can kind of just discuss it as a group after you've had some time to look at it and think about it.
Or is there, I don't think I've ever seen the ferry marshalling.
The ferry marshalling bylaw,
Yeah.
it basically has things like pull all the way up and don't sit in the yellow X'd out areas.
Oh, it doesn't have anything to do with the actual structure, because it's so critical.
No, it's a guide for a person in a vehicle to know
Oh,
what they're
okay.
supposed to do.
Okay, yeah. When you said that, I was thinking, oh, the Snug Cove ferry marshalling plan, that's been the thing that's been debated
Well,
since
that's,
the
yeah, we have
Jurassic
plans,
era.
that's a different thing.
Yeah, because that
Where-
is very
what
much a
happened.
social, structural thing, and the big failing of Snug Cove as a space, in my opinion. But anyway, yeah, that's, yeah, almost nobody wants to go there after all the contention.
You've got lighting down here, and you've got overlaps, transport, PIA, night sky, BL,
Yeah,
what does
BL's
that mean?
bylaw and P is plan, I was just short on space. Yeah, go ahead.
You've got view corridors, view from marina or to marina. There isn't going to be anymore. And that's a waste of time. You've got the view from the library that's existing that limits out certain things because they didn't want to look at boats at the time, they want to look at trees. That's somewhat invalid now anyway. And no one else can get a view. The only one that could have had a view was the distillery. Not that I care one way or the other, but, it's just wasting your time talking about it.
So maybe that's in the lower priority section. Sorry, this got really tiny.
I'm just wondering if the fire safety issue isn't already covered by existing requirements for buildings.
Building codes.
Yeah.
So the fire safety question is actually because we as a municipality have started to embrace the Firesmart program. And in that program, there's a lot of different guidelines that make assumptions about what is the nature of the built area around. So it's kind of designed for a building in a forest. And so as we've started to embrace Firesmart and use those guidelines and apply them, the question would be, how do we adapt those to more of a village area? And then also looking at things like heritage and the arts and crafts field, if we start to talk about materials, there can be some repercussions in terms of fire. So it's more like a thing that we might want to keep in mind, that we're not conflicting with some of the new fire guidelines, especially moving forward, because it's becoming a more and more hot
I don't
topic.
think they're applicable at all for the code. And that there's just nowhere in the code that's dense forest or building up to that normal setbacks don't cover.
Yeah, so one of the things that I talked about with Jennifer McGowan, the emergency planner, is in the Firesmart guidelines at this time, they recommend no planting within 1.5 meters of a building. So if we were to apply that in just from that statement throughout Snug Cove, I think it would result in a lot of landscaping being altered. And so there are ways to say, okay, in this section, rather than just saying let's eliminate all plantings within 1.5 meters of the building, there's a plant list that's in the current guidelines, and we could update that list to have only plants that are less combustible, and then we can say these are plants that are recommended and are Firesmart friendly. So that would be one example of where.
He's overthinking it in Snug Cove. I mean, your setback is only, 5 foot.
There are issues.
But yet, we say plant a lot of plants around it.
There are issues potentially in the development of the surplus lands, because they're nested right into Crippen. They border the park, and that's pretty critical. I think there's an aesthetic aspect to that too, in as much as the spectrum of the fire issue is one of the most unique things about the Cove is the fact that you have all this dense stuff and then bang, you're into forest, and that you can, I mean, it's the integration of those two, the interface is poor because it's a giant swath of asphalt. There's been no attempt to bring the forest into the Cove, which is a super hot place to be in the summer, and I mean that in literally heat.
Yeah.
And that distinction is something that should be respected. There should be, in any of the development of those lands, there should be transitional things that recognize the context. That's really important. Getting at it.
You've got another one in building masses here, and the uniqueness is the greater tolerance for density and closeness to street. That conflicts with some of the other things that you're talking about.
Well, the original the old general store was right on the street originally. It had a very European aspect to it in that regard.
What do you mean, as you go down further, village center functionality, the economic development plan?
So that's looking at, do we want to talk about the function of it as a village center? So sometimes design guidelines are more aesthetic, and sometimes they can be more about how the place functions, meaning the relationship, say, between people on the street and people in the buildings. Do we want there to be a lot of open facades, like more of a shopping sort of street feel, that kind of a function? And how would we achieve that? So some of it can be more functional and some is more static. So that's sort of trying to capture that idea. And it's related to the economic development plan because it has to do with, it is a commercial center. And
Well,
that is the primary function, is as a commercial center.
again, I don't know why we're thinking of that or considering it or part of this. And again, I use the distillery. What economic function is it providing for the community? You know, it's nice to say all those things, but if you don't enforce it or have the need to even, you know, the people are gonna put in what they wanna put in, and they know probably better than you or I what is needed, you know, the developer that's doing it.
So it sounds like you might be interested in a more restricted scope where we try to be just very specific about the design guidelines. Is that what you're
The
trying to do?
design guidelines has nothing to do with the functionality or the economic development, to me.
Well, in the sense of you wouldn't want a real industrial facility in the Cove. You want it to have some kind of a I mean, even the distillery, its function is, it does have it's a storefront.
But that would be zoning, wouldn't it?
Yeah, potentially.
Hopefully it wouldn't come
I'm just
under
thinking of
design.
the integration of the two economic functions and social functions, that they should be sonors, that they aren't conflicting severely.
And sometimes that gets into the intent as well, so when you're writing an intent statement in a design guideline, is the intent to have a look of a village or to have the function of a village? And you can clarify between which one you're seeking. So function might focus more on having areas where people can gather, and whether they look like one thing or look like another thing doesn't matter as much, but they need to have, say, shelter from rain, something like that, right? Rather than saying there must be awnings, but maybe those awnings are such that no one would stand under them and shelter their aesthetic. So that's kind of play
That's
with those
relevant.
two pieces.
That didn't used to be an issue in traditional design. It was just all came of a piece, you know.
Well, and that gets into the philosophy of arts and crafts as well, because if we were to follow it not as an aesthetic but as a philosophy, all things would have a function.
Here, we're 5 minutes over.
There was a thing in the, in several of the plan, the things that Steph sent out, the other Whistler and Victoria, the idea of varying building heights and everything.
The idea of what, I'm sorry?
Varying building heights
Mm-hmm.
and setbacks, that kind of thing too, are all, that's kind of part of, I guess, implicit in that arts and crafts.
Okay, so that would be kind of a higher, that's getting into the building massing.
Yeah, but it is specific.
Any other comments on this, and then we'll move into the recommendation.
And these two, we pass them out in parts so people can fill them out now, or like continue to think about it and give to Jennifer later as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So we might do a last shot at it. It's just
Scan it in an
thoughts.
email to me, or send it an email with some comments with you later and some thoughts.
I'm feeling like some of these categories could sort of be collapsed into each other and formulated as a concept. And because I think there has to be way less stuff if they're gonna be even read and paid attention to. So, for example, I don't know, streetscape, building massing, and community liveliness could all be one category. It's about how you use the lot to encourage people to connect in the village or whatever.
When you're talking about pedestrian navigation or the walkable density of it, there's 2 sidewalks going up one side of the street and the other one. Other than that, and a sidewalk going down whatever lot it is to a back door somewhere, there isn't much. I mean, that's nice to think about that, but we don't have that option.
Of the pedestrian
Yeah.
ways? Well, there's quite a bit of pedestrian activity that happens there, whether it's from that walkway that's between the marina and the buildings.
Well, that's fine, we're in. I'm talking about the rest of the cove that has to be developed.
Well, what
They
about
don't have that option.
what about the surplus lands development? Yeah, I mean, that's all sort of coming stuff. I know on the Parks and Trails and Greenways Committee, a lot of that is considered as part of connectivity, be it a sidewalk or, I mean,
Is that considered in Snug Cove?
yes, it is,
Lot 3 is, yeah.
yeah.
The fire hall part is in the periphery.
Yeah, fire hall.
And the rest of lot 3 is within the development permit area, like the main.
I mean, insofar as collapsing these things kind of makes sense because they're they have a relationship to one another.
Mm-hmm.
Within that collapsed, overarching
Yeah,
rubric,
that's
you
what I'm
would
trying.
need to differentiate,
Yeah.
to be specific, because that seems to be one of the issues that's a problem here, is the lack of specificity.
And this is definitely not intended to become the table of contents or anything like that. It's just a
Yeah.
list of
Yeah,
things that I thought might come up in the meeting.
yeah, mine does.
The next one you have on is vehicular navigation. You don't have anything about on-street parking. And for the community and always those shops to survive, they need parking in front of them. And I
So
think
that would be
that's the
part of
biggest
that.
issue that we'll be facing.
That kind, isn't that distilled to the, whatever the Snug Cove plan is ultimately for ferry marshalling? I mean, there've been so many things proposed, and there, you get all this pushback from the community. Finally, they came out, what was it, James Tour's mix and match, 4 ideas for it, finally had some support, and suddenly it disappeared, nobody's talking about it anymore. That's the only one that
NIMBYs.
ever had any kind of coherence or community support in the years I've been here, which has been a while.
Well, David Wrench's plan for the ferry marshaling is probably the most realistic and the best plan, I think, that I've seen.
I don't think I've seen that. If I have, it's been years. No, I probably have, but it's been years ago. I'm not up to date on what.
But
there
at
was
some time, we're gonna have to face that.
I
And
agree,
it's
it's
just,
huge.
our council haven't faced that yet.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest single thing about Europe. Everything else will depend on whatever is ultimately done with the ferry marshalling by Cove, I think. It's the one big failing of Snug Cove, why it is so wanting. I noticed that the first time it came to Bowen, like 40 years ago. Why doesn't this work? It should work, but it doesn't. And then I realized it's the road, it's just this big. And even one of Tour's ideas was to bend the road, to get rid of that linearity and break it up. You know, a lot of really simple ideas, but anyway.
Well,
that'll have to be
the
it.
biggest problem is the parks own the property and control everything. And they, at one time, they were interested in doing something, but then we had a NIMBY council that didn't want to do anything. And they at one time told us, until you get a council that tells us that what you want to do, we're not going to do anything.
Well, there are a lot of problems. I mean, there's ferries. They said, you know, the idea was put out, well, have angled parking on the north side. Because you see people coming off the ferry, the first thing they want to do, they've never been here, they want to park, and they're halfway to Tunstall Bay before they, and yet, angled parking, ferry says, no angled parking, because people are gonna back out into ferry traffic. Nothing happens in the Cove when the ferry's unloading. It just stops. It's not an issue, really. If you live here, you know that. But no, they get their 2 cents worth in, and it's completely, it's from people who have never been here, I guess. But, you know, those sorts of things,
Yeah.
anyway, it's just
Yeah. So we'll definitely
digressing.
have to think about the relationship between this and any future ferry marshalling efforts.
Absolutely, I think that's a gigantic thing in the whole disposition of the. Not that the other stuff is important, but.
So I want to make sure that we are able to have some kind of recommendation, if possible, at the end of this discussion. So the idea is that by this time, you might feel comfortable recommending council to direct staff to develop a work plan with a dedicated budget that would include revising and updating the current guidelines. But we need to also be a bit more specific about the scope of what we're talking about. So to help that, I've put together 3 sort of packages, and we can pull things from one to the other without a problem. From smallest scope to largest, the minimal to the in-depth. So this is what they look like. So the minimal update is essentially taking the current guidelines document and making it more aesthetic and removing any immediate conflicts or, you know, grammatical issues, clarifications that are small, that don't really change anything about the essence of it. That wouldn't really require public engagement, it could be done more or less internally, and it wouldn't have any particular costs involved, and we could also do it by the end of this year, which is the original timeline for the directive. The second option I'm calling priority review because it involves looking at the priorities such as the list that I've provided now and trying to say, okay, what are the priorities that we want to address in the design guidelines? And so we can get a little bit of a shift in terms of what the guidelines are covering and possibly an amendment to the land use bylaws to make sure that they're staying up to date to what's in here as well, since we have guidelines there and this guideline document. And that would involve some workshops where you could invite particular people, such as businesses or users in Snug Cove. And that would have some cost for the engagement events particularly, and it would take a bit more time. And then the third, more in-depth review is really questioning the whole design guidelines from top to bottom, and is a bit more grassroots. So it's more intensive public engagement. And in this case, I would recommend that we integrate it with the economic plan engagement so that people are not being asked to engage in different things at the same time. It gets confusing. So then we can just have like one larger engagement that lets people inform us of what they're looking for both. And in this case, we could even consider the boundaries of the DP areas, an amendment to that OCP map potentially, and also amending the land use bylaws. So that's kind of the largest scope, and it would also have a bigger budget and possibly consultant fees. So what do you think of these possibilities?
Number one.
Okay. Thanks, Ronnie, for being very concise. You know what you want.
I don't think it would hurt to talk to a few people who live and work in the Cove, which is under 2, I guess.
I would also think number 2 because I think a lot of the problems that are associated with things that have happened recently would be in root in this document which really needs to be brought up to latest best practices and have some agreement to other bylaws like the land use bylaw, etc. Without that, you have no enforcement. So,
Or coherence.
Or coherence, right? So I really think number 2 as well.
I'd be inclined in that direction, and I think probably an important part of it is just the presentation of the document needs to be really refined. It needs good color photographs. It needs the sense of authority about it, and that we know what we're talking about. You know, a first draft kind of thing.
But to be clear, that is included in the scope in number 1. So that would involve color photos, updating to our current fonts, and so it would not stand out from the other plans as having less care.
Yeah, yeah, and I fair enough, but I think latest best practices is certainly something to be included in that thing. The extent to which a workshop would work is, I mean, we've already had, this whole panel has been dealing with stakeholders coming in and ignoring the bylaw, or the guidelines. They're guidelines, so therefore we can sidestep them kind of thing. I don't think it's malicious, it's just not, there's been nothing to compel them in a different direction. So maybe some kind of a fusion of minimal update, just refined, then to include
The
best
1.5?
practices.
1.5?
Number 1/2, 1.5.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Well, I mean, you can mix and match, I mean, if that's realistic, so that, because you can't exclude the public.
I don't think there's burning excitement about looking at it though. So,
No, I agree.
So
I
I
would
think it'd
agree.
be pretty low key.
Yeah, it's not like, the fairy marshalling.
No.
Yeah, incendiary, but,
Well, and the one sort of feeds the other, right? So the more changes you make, the more people will need to be engaged, and the less changes, the
Right.
less it's necessary.
But if there's a kind of self-evidence to a lot of it, then maybe public input is really extraneous to the process. There definitely needs to be that greater explication, if that's the word, of what we mean by the arts and crafts, that it's, and to define it as a set of underlying principles or patterns or something that are still flexible.
Mhm.
You know, the idea, this isn't, arts and crafts just sounds too, like it's a vernacular, it's a building vernacular,
Exactly.
which is maybe too strict. It needs to be in the spirit of kind of that kind of idea, you know?
That actually aligns a lot with best practices that I didn't include in here because they kind of didn't match with what the council told us to do. It was to affirm the arts and crafts, but they actually, in the best practices, they generally say not to use style nomenclature and instead to just define what you mean.
Yeah.
Rather than
Exactly.
assume that style then has these.
Well, in the updated document, if you had more, obviously the old general store, an example, other successful examples, be it Village Square, certain buildings, aspects of, to define what we mean here by this, and the old cabins, you know, things that are good concrete examples,
Mhm.
and then maybe explain what is it here, or have examples of what is it in these that are particular, that are congruent with the idea, though maybe not specific, not purely imitated. You know?
So maybe what I'm hearing then is that we want to look at the scope as described in 2, but maybe less intensive of an engagement as might be implied
Yeah.
there. Is that?
It's fine.
I think Betty's right, there's probably, nobody's gonna get particularly spooled up about changes that we might make about those sorts of things. They'd be happy if they saw good examples of buildings. Well, I've heard lots of comments on some of the ones, like the distillery, like the credit union I have on. People, I've overheard them even in the street, what's that doing here? That kind of thing. Oh, really? And the other thing is that metal cladding on the new pub that you see when you come up.
Yeah.
It's pretty confronting.
A ton of people comment on that.
So that's a code requirement. So
Exactly.
they're stuck with that.
Well,
Either that or concrete
with
blocks.
the original plan, they hadn't, it was gonna be set back further. They didn't realize that they had to carry that wall out all the way. It wasn't in the original design, but I guess the regulations, the code just said, no, you gotta do it.
Well,
What are you gonna do?
firewall would be required, but there
Well,
are
yeah.
different ways to have
There's
a firewall.
different ways to
exactly.
treat that. You didn't have to put a bright corrugated metal.
Yeah, it would be probably pretty expensive treatments. I thought sort of a bas relief of something, but that would be expensive.
Well, we gotta remember that there's only 3 people that we have to deal with in the code. The Snug, which owns 2 lots, and the yellow house next to him, which is 3 lots. The restaurant next to it has already been sold and to a developer, and he's probably gonna have a restaurant at the bottom, but he'll have 2 or 3 residences on the top. And, you know, he's a developer, he'll probably do a good job. And then the only other place that hasn't been developed in the Cove that could be is that little lot where there's just a house on it right now. You know where I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah.
I
That's-
can't
that
remember
was
the
burnt
name
down.
of the people.
Outside
Yeah.
Nelson, Lapine's old place,
Well, that
I just
and
put up
the
the
parking
maps.
lot.
in the parking lot.
And
I mean, there's
the-
still
and
enough
the-
there.
But
The
then,
general store
yeah,
building
general
is
store.
probably
I mean-
not long to be redeveloped.
You know, years ago, Doug Berry did on the request of the owners, the previous owners of the general store, he did a revamp for that building. And I thought, the only revamp you could do is with a D6 cap. And he came up with a surprisingly good design. It was
For that little house?
No, this is for the new general store, and the whole thing, he did it, but he said, and this was years ago, he said, 20 years ago maybe, he said, it's gonna be $1 million. That's nice, but no. So they never, so, who knows what it would cost now. Anyway,
Yeah.
you're right, someday the general store, or the new general store is an issue.
I'm just going back to the ending.
You have 1, 1, 2 2s, and 1 2.
1, 1.5.
Yeah, 1 2. Yeah, 1/2.
1, 2, 2, 1.5.
So that's 1
Two
3/4.
point
Three.
1.5 is an option.
Do you want to have a vote on this then? I guess I'm supposed to do this, aren't I?
Yeah, sit up.
Who would vote just for one minimal update? Who would vote for 1.5 minimal update with, I guess it was the best practices thing? I would.
Yeah, that's,
Nobody's
it's
voting.
with less consultation, yeah.
One
Oh.
or two, either one of those, somewhere in between them.
Vince?
Yeah.
Two without intensive consultation.
Well, that's sort of the 1.5. like,
Yeah, okay,
Okay,
that's what I'm
so
asking.
two without the consultation, but I don't think I don't know the public's appetite for such a thing, so I'm fine with that.
I believe that we can revisit if we do 1.5 and at the consultation we get 100 people in the room, all
Yeah.
with different
We
interests.
can do more.
Yeah, sure.
So do we just want to recommend something like to revise and update current guidelines through a priority review and limited public engagement or something like that as a recommendation, or how do you want to?
Well, best practices, I think, should
Yeah.
be included in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, or maybe we want to say with, rather than limited, like priority engage, or one, or, how do we say it?
But you
Can you
Capture
go back
that.
to
You
the
put
full
it in
description?
yourself.
So,
With targeted public engagement?
Yeah.
Targeted,
that's good.
that's,
Yeah,
there
maybe-
we go, stuff.
yeah, so 2 with targeted, yeah, whatever.
So, revise and update current Snug Cove design guidelines with a priority review with targeted public engagement.
Yeah.
So the
With or
next
using-
step would
using
be,
priority.
after we present this to council, if they approve it, that I would put together a work plan that would flesh out that idea and bring that back to you all, so that you have an opportunity to see what you voted for.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. All in favor of that revision? Motion passed. What are we at here now?
Thank you.
Um,
That's the end of my stuff.
So I have more just an update. The one here is the sign definition. So at a previous meeting, we had made a recommendation to council to revise how we define signs. And the issue is currently it's like our sign definition means it's like a separate structure. And so council agreed with that and directed staff to do a change. And so I have been looking at sending to our advisory planning commission a new sign definition as part of an OCP review, or not OCP, a land use bylaw review. And I had a new, and I think Steph, what you've included here, I've got the wrong
Okay.
sample definition.
Oh,
But essentially what I sent to, or what I'm sending, because we don't meet until October, is essentially the West Van definition of a sign.
you sent it to me, I put it up.
See, what's on there is like the wrong, I didn't send it to you. But essentially, it's a more encompassing definition of what a sign means, so it's like includes if it's painted on the side of a building or something like that, so included as a sign.
I don't know what you want me to do.
It's okay, it's fine.
Did I make a mistake?
I may have sent you the wrong, like that email isn't actually an email, right? That's just the, that's just the PDF, I think.
Oh, it's on email now, so, alright.
It's just that PDF.
That's
it's wrong. It's okay.
Oh, that email,
Yeah,
I can put that out. What was it? Oh, right, okay. Give me a sec. Sorry about that. Oh, yeah, that's my mistake. Oh, right, okay. Can you talk to each other?
But so I don't
I had
think,
to
you know, I'm
move
not even coming necessarily for recommendation council, just, or to you, but just tell you that's where we're going, is to go to the land use bylaw, and then we will circle back to you if we've had sort of the first kick at it, but I just wanted to send it to you to say, this is what we're thinking of, we're moving to change the land use bylaw definition of a sign to capture all kinds of various things as signs. And I think the goal being then through the work Jennifer's doing in the design guidelines is have a better sign section as well, that then says, okay, in general, these are signs, things where you can have signs, and then in the design guidelines themselves, more direction in terms of these are signs that we want to see in Snug Cove, and that's where sort of the overlapping stuff says, we'll capture everything as a sign, and then in Snug Cove, we'll say, these are, we want you to have these types of signs, or not have these types of signs, or whatever it may be.
Okay, sorry about that.
Right. So essentially, yeah, just changing it so it's not about the structure as much as it's about the, the words, the symbols, and the visual
Yeah.
stuff, and then that's a sign, or which is, it's about directing them, so, yeah. Yeah.
Anybody have any issues with that definition?
No, it's much clearer.
So should we make that a point to recommend that that be included, that definition? As a clarification? Is that what we do procedurally?
Oh, is that what you want, Daniel?
Well, is that where it is?
Yeah, I don't even need it, I think, at this point, because the ABC will have the first go in terms of land use bylaw, and then it's like it can come back here.
Okay.
We'll actually then have a bylaw drafted, but just sort of updating you where it's going, and if you had any informal comments to say, actually, this, you know, is terrible, throw it out, then I would take that, but I don't need a recommendation at this point.
Okay.
There is one distinction that's different, which is the visibility statement. In the first one, we talk about visible from any street or lot other than the lot of the sign. And the second one says visible from any public street. But we do have a lot of non-public streets and other things here, so
Yeah, that's a good.
it
point.
might be good to
Yeah.
keep that part.
Keep that same language, any street or lot, yeah, okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
good point. Got a lot of private thoroughfares.
Well, that appears to knock off 4.2. In terms of new business, the Firesmart manual, was that, Steph, was that a?
That is provided for context, so
Okay.
as it came up earlier, those principles should be considered in the guideline review. So just making sure you guys keep having that information available to you.
And the 2019 Island Plan.
And that's also, that's on every
And
council.
these are just information
agenda.
things, and the Heritage Commission work
Yeah.
plan is there as well, okay? And any recommendations that come out of that? I don't know if anybody's had a chance to read through all of that, I haven't, I just,
So sorry, Jeremy, the recommendation is for Jennifer's, design guideline update, so you made the recommendation, and this is just the background material in that, so the Firesmart and the Heritage was part of what Jennifer was showing, just other stuff that are happening that's sort of relevant to the sign
Fine.
building design
Yeah.
stuff. And then 4.2 is my update on signs.
okay, so we've covered everything?
Yeah.
All right, anything further?
Just under, so we don't have the next meeting scheduled, we don't have any, I'm trying to think through it, Jennifer, we don't have any applications in that we're looking to schedule a meeting for. So probably the next one that I would consider will be after the design guideline update goes to council to get recommendation for us to work on a work plan, to bring the work plan before you. I think would be our next meeting we're likely to have, unless we get an application or something, which case we'll schedule one. That's-
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I would also be interested in hearing from you all, if there's anyone particularly interested in being involved in the early stages of that, because otherwise I'll put together something, and assuming that it passes council, and then I'll bring it to you, but I would rather not put something together if at the end you already have like a really strong opinion about a particular part, or, you know, particularly like if you would have some material on the principles of arts and crafts that you'd like to share, or something like that.
I can
It's
look
good for
into
me
it.
to know about it.
I'll look into it, see what I think about that.
Yeah, I guess just nobody, if anyone has any, goes home and has more thoughts about design guidelines, send it to Jennifer or, yeah.
Her email, she's been CC'd on this meeting's correspondence.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, adjournment. I guess do we vote on adjournment?
Nope.
Let's go, okay.
And there's no more quorum, it's adjourned.
Great.
Thank you.